The title of my talk today, Multivalent Mercury, the Politics of Quicksilver's Half-Lives and Half-Truths and Amazonian Gold Mines. Today, I'm going to be talking about a region called Madre de Dios in the Peruvian Amazon, nestled between the borders of Acre in Brazil and Pando in Bolivia. Madre de Dios, as you all likely know, means the Virgin Mary or the Mother of God in Spanish. The irony of the region's name is not lost on the many sex workers or their gold miner clients who have set up camp in the rainforest extraction zones. So thank you, Dani, for talking about Amazonia, because I am absolutely talking about that today. There's a gold rush occurring throughout the South American continent. One can argue that this gold rush has been happening for some time. It is not a new phenomenon. Gold was one of the many tantalizing drivers that propelled the likes of Pizarro and Cortez to seek El Dorado, creating genocide in its wake. What is occurring in Madre de Dios, Peru, is yet another wave of natural resource extraction that continues more than 40 years after Eduardo Galeano wrote Las Venas Abiertas de América Latina. Gold miners use liquid mercury to amalgamate the gold flecks found in the soil, which has helped to create massive deforestation and desert where there used to be rainforest. Eduardo Galeano wrote, in the colonial and neo-colonial alchemy, gold changes into scrap metal and food into poison. This appears to be the case in Madre de Dios, where the mercury devastation, as you can see here in this image, has taken a toll. This is a 2018 report that cites 170,000 acres of deforested Amazon. But also the fires that Dani spoke about has contributed to even more. I shudder to think about what the amount of deforestation is at this point throughout the Amazon across countries. The mercury that is used to amalgamate the gold in artisanal and small-scale gold mining continues to follow colonial trade routes, where mines in Mexico and Spain traffic in mercury exports. Mercury is now illegal to import without a permit in Peru as of 2016. Bolivia is not nearly as involved in gold mining as Peru, but it is the top importer of mercury. And here in this image, this is at the tri-frontier, this is the Alfondega, as you can see, on the Brazil and Peruvian border, and Cobija in Bolivia is right nearby. For anyone who has crossed rainforest border checkpoints, you know how porous these borders are. And Cobija, the sister town in Bolivia that touches Brazil and Peru, is known as a trafficking hub for many things: electronics, clothes, perfume, and money. In my presentation today, I will briefly explain how artisanal and small-scale gold mining took place in Madre de Dios, the role of the interoceanic highway, the mining process that uses mercury, and the kind of mercurial assets or toxic assets that are part of a predatory global capitalism. Mercury, Hermes, or Quicksilver has seeped into the psyches of philosophers and emperors, Mad Hatters, sushi eaters, and cavity fillers. For gold miners and indigenous communities, El Mercurio represents conflicting ideas about their anthropogenic futures: modernity, magic, poison, or environmental destruction. For gold miners who labor in the mines, the potent neurotoxin is linked to causing uncontrollable anger and violent behavior, but because of mercury's delayed effects in humans, public health outreach has failed to convey the danger of contamination. So maybe Bolsonaro and Trump are contaminated. They have some mercury problems. So on the environment, mercury has much more visibility. Mercury poisons the soil as well as water systems, killing plants and animals. Yet Mercury is also the Roman god of trade, speed, and communication. Mercury's multivalent meanings as a mythological trickster, governing language and economic ventures, and naturally occurring mineral and elemental chemical, complicate simple framings of biopolitics in such anthropogenic landscapes, where the half-life of Mercury will outlast other forms of non-human and human life. So there are two things that I want to note about artisanal and small-scale gold mining. This might not look small-scale to you. The small scale only refers to just the technologies used. But as you can see, the devastation is quite large scale. So the mines use suction pump technologies that I'll explain in a little bit, or backhoes and heavy machinery, as you see with this tractor in the top image. So again, small scale refers to just the technologies used, but not in fact the devastation done. Interoceanic Highway, or L'Interoceanica, or as those of you in Brazil know, it's the Estrada Continental, or UBR 364. So this road in diplomatic and development terms is a network spanning the entirety of the South American continent, the main artery of which runs some 3,500 miles from Brazil's Port of Santos in the region of Sao Paulo to the Peruvian ports of Ilo, Matarani, and San Juan de Marcona. In the year 2000, Brazilian President Fernando Henrique Cardoso led the first meeting of South American presidents in Brasilia. Cardoso, along with Bolivia's president at the time, Hugo Banzar Suarez, and Peru's Alberto Fujimori, since before Fujimori fled to Japan in an attempt to avoid corruption and human rights abuse charges. These three presidents voted to commit funds for La Interoceanica. And there's really a fascinating history to this highway, one mired, as you all likely know, in the current Lava Jato scandal, and the Brazilian company Odebrecht that won the contract to build the thoroughfare. But what's important here about the Interoceanica was that it was the first paved road in Madre de Dios, connecting the Peruvian Andean city of Cusco with the triple frontier Amazonian border. So just to underline, Madre de Dios is a region that's roughly the size of Portugal, and it had no paved road running through it before 2011. So this has really facilitated the movement of heavy machinery, like that tractor that you saw. And because the timing of the road's building coincided with the fall of the United States dollar and the volatile global economic climate and the always high demand for gold, this road made it easier to transport people and machinery, and made it lucrative for the artisanal and small-scale gold miners in Madre de Dios to extract gold dust brought into solid form via the addition of liquid mercury. Oh, I went ahead too far. So quicksilver or liquid mercury amalgamates readily with gold, making it a cheap and effective substance for those working less by hand and, more by hand and less by machine. It's also a highly toxic substance when it's dumped into rivers and onto the ground, turning a rainforest into a desert. Most, but not all of the men stream down from the Andes, and they are joined by Brazilian gold miners. There are lots of garimpeiros in Madre de Dios, and a growing number of Chinese and Korean extraction companies that have taken up residence. And I should say all of this is done illegally, and it's without formal land concessions and often invading on indigenous community land. So before I explain more about the process of mercury amalgamation, I want to forecast, and after all, this is what mercury is about, the meteorological barometer. It measures temperature, barometric pressure. It literally is the unit of measurement of our quickly heating planet. I see these gold miners primarily indigenous in terms of they are native Quechua Aymara speakers. Many of them are not native Spanish speakers and have difficulty operating in Spanish. The Peruvian government often casts these gold miners as always already criminals. And this continues with some of Dani's theme. These gold miners are seen as los contaminadores, the contaminators, but also as los contaminados, the contaminated. And as you can see in this graph here, artisanal and small-scale gold mining is the largest source of mercury contamination in the world. So if you see how it's compared to only 5% of large-scale gold mining, which would be the large multinational corporations, largely situated in the global north, Europe, the United States, Canada. I see this as a classic graph of environmental racism, where you pitch the biggest polluters as the brown people against the white collar, quote, clean miners of the global north. So these miners are seen as contaminating with and being contaminated by mercury on top of the existing, quote, encultured racism that Peruvian anthropologists Marisol de la Cadena and Daniela Gondolfo write so powerfully about. The aspirations to limeño whiteness lower Cusqueño notions of cultural achievement. And los serranos are not considered lettered or native Spanish speakers, as I mentioned. And because of their Quechua Aymara language status and mountain blood, this marks them as less than human. After centuries of Spanish colonial rule and the post-independence trauma of the Shining Path, social relations are structured by post-colonial greed and natural resource extraction. The campesinos flowing from the Andes to the Amazon are looking for ways to eat and to feed their families. So much so that in 2009, the Peruvian Minister of the Environment estimated 30,000 gold miners operating illegally and very visibly on the land and the national nature reserves. This number has been cited so often, I've heard it almost until 2015, 2017, until the last year at the Minamata Conference on Mercury at the United Nations, and then just a couple of weeks ago at this conference in Poland on mercury as a global pollutant that I just attended. And now the numbers that political officials from Peru are citing 70,000 gold miners, and they're primarily inhabiting protected area. So it didn't even take the lack of IBAMA, just the environmental protections for this part of Peru are so lax. There's hardly anyone able to stand against what's happening. So these are all unsubstantiated numbers for me. As you can imagine, it's hard to take a government census, and they bear further verification. So these are part of the half-truths that I'm talking about in terms of both the government peddling the not quite true. My intention here in citing them is not to promote or discredit their veracity, but rather to convey that there are a lot of people in the rainforest using mercury to extract gold flecks from the Amazonian soil and water. So this is another, I don't know if this will load here for you guys. I can share the PowerPoint, and this can be a resource that documents in the Spanish language a bit of what is happening in Madre de Dios. The process of small-scale gold mining, as I mentioned, utilizes two different technologies depending on the geology. In some parts of Madre de Dios, there used to be nuggets, and so you would use backhoes for this. But in the image that you see here, mining pits are dug and filled with water, and small rafts with a motor and a suction called la chupadera takes the sediment from the bottom of the mining pit. Or you can also just dredge from the water itself. So what the chupadera does, and you see it on this raft, it sucks the sediment up from the bottom of the pit, and then it sends it down. You can see a trocha or a ramp, and this separates the larger sediment from the smaller. And then that sediment with the gold flecked soil is mixed with mercury. And there are a lot of different numbers cited in terms of how much mercury is used per sediment. I've heard everything from 2 parts mercury, liquid mercury, to 1 part sediment, which is a lot. It's there's so many tons of mercury being dumped into this area. And it's an estimated 400 tons have entered into Amazonian soil and river streams since the boom started in 2001. Acho que, Dani, se você pode mutar o microfone. Okay, there's some background noise. So I want to explain some of the process here. This is a bottle of El Mercurio and the Espanol brand called the Matador of the Mines. And there are ways that, because gold has a kind of female character, and mercury, as you can see here just in this image, has this kind of virile, strong, bull-like quality, the mercury is seen as having a very masculine aspect. And because it grabs the mercury from the bottom, the mercury grabs the gold from the mines and the muck and murk of this water, people see it as very magical and not as poison. So the next step for the gold miners is to put that sediment and the liquid mercury together. And then, in sort of the tradition of winemaking, men stand knee deep in old oil drums, mixing this mercury gold sediment bearing water and this kind of mush for hours until they have gold amalgams. Then the excess mercury and sediment is dumped onto the ground, usually near a water source, if it is section technology. And then the mercury must be burned off to leave the gold. So already this process is incredibly, incredibly toxic, but it's very difficult, again, to explain just how toxic it is because of the delayed effects on the adult body. So most of the miners that I worked with would absolutely consider me to be a crazy gringa environmentalist, and they would point to the liquid mercury in their hands and be like, how could this be poison? You know, this is magic. So turning people away from mercury usage has proved very difficult given how delayed the effects can be on adult humans. On human children and the landscape, the impact has more visibility. Like all heavy metals, mercury can pass the blood-brain barrier, swim through amniotic fluid, and for indigenous communities that rely on fish as a staple in their diet, the ramifications have been dire. So the mercury vapor that you see in this photo, this is blowtorch alchemy. You have to burn off the mercury that amalgamated with the gold to have pure gold. In May 2016, the Peruvian government declared a state of emergency for Madre de Dios when research groups from Stanford and Duke, respectively, showed elevated levels of mercury in river fish in both indigenous and non-indigenous communities. But for the indigenous communities, the Haramba, Shipibo, Guinea, Jaminawa, the levels of mercury contamination were the highest just based on their consumption of fish. In March of 2019, Operation Mercury was announced. And here you see some of the devastation from the gold mining. So a second state of an emergency this year has begun, but it's less about the mercury than it is about the sex workers and sex trafficking in the mines. Mercury then has come to mean more than just the silver and metal toxicity. It has come to mean gold, sex trafficking, money laundering, and more. From the mercury mines of Santa Barbara in Peru, known as the mines of death, to the Mad Hatters of the early 20th century in Europe, from the mercantile systems of colonialism that Eduardo Galeano spoke about, to those of us, like myself, who still has mercury silver amalgams in my mouth. Mercury has had many different meanings. Its multivalence, however, has different kinds of half-lives and half-truths, particularly for me living in the United States, and I imagine for those of you who are not fans of Bolsonaro, we have mercurial or volatile presidents promoting toxic politics and economics, and with mercury rising on the global thermometer of a quickly heating planet. And yet, for many people in the current configurations of global capital, mercury represents the future, not the apocalypse. What kinds of messages then can we bring to such biopolitical renderings of climate change in a neo-mercantile, anthropogenic landscape? Thank you.